Good evening and welcome. It is an honor and a pleasure to be introducing our program for this Memorial Day weekend. Tonight is an opportunity to celebrate and bring awareness. We are here to celebrate our veterans, so please, if there are any veterans in the audience, will you please stand, if you can, to receive a well-deserved round of applause. Thank you for your service, and we also thank your fellow service members who paid the ultimate sacrifice protecting this country and our freedoms. Far too often, our veterans' stories go untold, unrecognized, and sadly forgotten. I never served in the military, so it would be foolish for me to stand up here and demand those who served to share and be open about their service. However, I want everyone who has served or is currently serving to know that your story is important, and it should be written, and it should be known. Thankfully, before Gene Moran passed away, he was able to share his story of service during World War II. Today, you are going to be able to hear from his family and from the author who spent many Thursdays interviewing him. Today, Gene Moran's story will be told, and it is all of our responsibilities to share it with others so that it is not forgotten. Here today from the Moran family, we have Joni Moran Peterson, Mike Bugs Moran, Judge Michael Moran, Laura Moran Hackman, Bridget Moran Trusoni, and most importantly, Aunt Joanne Moran, Eugene's youngest sister. As I said before, we have the author, John Armbruster. It is very fitting to have John here, not only as the author of this book, but also because of the work John does outside of writing this masterpiece. John has taught American history and government at the middle school and high school levels for 29 years. Before becoming a teacher, he wrote for public radio and newspapers after graduating from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He lives on a small farm outside of Viroqua, Wisconsin, in the heart of the Driftless region. Never heard of that until today. His late wife, Carmen, passed away in 2012 after a long fight with cancer. They have two sons, Matthew and Joseph, and Matthew is here today with us. So a round of applause for Matthew. John has won many awards and honors for his work in the classroom. Some are Disney Teaching Award for Outstanding Creativity and Innovation, Middle School Teacher of the Year Award. He has also been recognized numerous times by the VFW Wisconsin District 11. He was even runner-up for the VFW state competition, and the American Legion Outstanding Educator Award for Verona County. Round of applause for our author, John. Finally, I would like to introduce Chris Hughes. She is here today to perform Danny Boy, and in one of the videos John will be sharing, you will see her amazing artistic abilities that brings Eugene's stories and parts of the book to life. So again, we will invite Chris on the stage, but if we can get a round of applause for all the people that are here tonight.
summer's gone, and all the roses falling. It's you, must go and I must bide. But come me back when summer's in the
Took a long time to make that book. And it started here, a small K-12 public school in the heart of the Kickapoo Valley, driftless region, in 1994. October 1994, North Crawford Schools, Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. It was an in-service day, no students at North Crawford Schools. I was 2 months into my rookie year as a middle and high school social studies teacher. I loved teaching history, but on that sunny late October day, I sat trapped in a molded plastic chair inside a windowless auditorium, daydreaming about escaping to a deer hunting stand or a cornfield goose blind. Our small K-12 public school sat next to the Kickapoo River, a crooked stream that twisted through a forested valley dotted with dairy farms just a few miles south of the town of Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. Ahead of me sat two men, visiting educators from another district. At break time, most of the teachers drifted out to the hall to head to the restroom or sip coffee. Not feeling like making small talk with strangers, I stayed in my seat, overheard the conversation in front of me. "Isn't this the school with the art teacher whose dad was shot down without a parachute and lived?" one of the men said to the other. I leaned forward. "Yeah, Joni Peterson," the other replied. "Dad was a tail gunner during World War II. I think he was shot down over Germany. I guess he fell some 4 miles or so before he hit the ground." Incredible. Doesn't make any sense. He came down in a chunk of the plane, from what I know, and the Germans captured him. It took a moment for my dulled brain to make sense of the words I had just heard. Shot down? Without a parachute? And lived? 4 miles? I could only catch snippets of the conversation as teachers shuffled back into the auditorium to take their seats. But I knew just where to go to get this story. Joni Peterson's art room sat right next to my classroom. Her art room functioned both as a student classroom and an unofficial teaching lounge. Conversation flowed easily there, but I was about to find out that one topic was taboo. I found Joni setting out construction paper and glue for the next school day and hurrying so she could get home. I burst into the room. "Is it true? The story I heard about your dad?" I asked. She paused, chuckled, and continued laying out construction paper. "Yes, it's true," she said. "Old Lean Gene, the fighting machine." I quickly shared with Joni the conversation I'd overheard a few hours earlier. "I heard his plane went down over Germany. How was he shot down? When? Where did he land? He was a tail gunner, right? What kind of plane? Flying Fortress? Liberator? How badly was he hurt? Did the Germans capture him right away? How long was he a prisoner?" Joni continued working but offered few answers. She did identify his plane as a Flying Fortress bomber. As a lifelong World War II airplane buff, the Flying Fortress bomber topped my list of favorite aircraft. "So when can your dad visit my classroom?" I asked. Joni paused and dropped a ream of construction paper on the table. She glared at me. "That's not happening. We don't go there." I should have known better. Many veterans don't share their war stories. On top of that, Joni had just lost her husband, a paralyzed Vietnam War veteran, to a heart attack a few months before I was hired at North Crawford. I muttered apologies and sank into silence. Joni shrugged. "It's all right," she said, "but we just don't talk about it." And now they're going to talk about it.
By the way, it's Lean, or Gene, the, no, you got me. No, it's Lean Gene, the dancing machine.
The
It's
book's
what I-
already done. I'm sorry. The editing is
Dancing
done.
machine.
And I will introduce, these are 5 of Gene's 9 children. And just as a side note, when Gene came home from the war, he had some pretty serious injuries, particularly his head injury. And a doctor told him, "Do not marry or have children. You will not be alive in 10 years with your injuries." 3 months later, he got married and he had 9 kids. Here are 5 of them. From your right to left, Pat, Bridget, Mike, Laura, and Joni. All right, guys, I ended with, we don't talk about it. Now it's your turn.
I could have used the cheerleader voice. We're done, Lori. I'm going to make this work. My sister Laura. Like John said, we don't go there. There's very little that we knew about Dad's war stories other than what we gleaned from my grandma's scrapbooks that she kept about Dad. I'm sure she kept scrapbooks about all of her kids, but the one for Dad had all kinds of stories from papers all over the country about falling 4 miles. I didn't know all the vocabulary, but pretty good stories. But that's all we knew is what we could get from the newspapers. When we tried to ask Dad a question, he usually would say, "You don't want to know. You don't want to go there." Okay, I have 2 short anecdotes about my dad. First one, I was 2nd grade. We had a Christmas program at St. Philip's, and Dad and my godfather and a whole bunch of other wonderful men that were all one big family at St. Philip's, they all left to go have a cigarette, or so they said. Well, all of them came back except my dad, but Santa was with them. And we were all lined up, all the little ones, and as a 7-year-old, it was finally my turn, and I climbed up on Santa's lap, and I heard this gravelly voice say, "What do you want for Christmas, little girl?" And I smelled Old Spice, and it was either Pabst Blue Ribbon or Blatz or a combo. And I looked up at Santa and smiled and said, "Oh, you smell just like my daddy." Another one is when, the other anecdote is from when I was somewhere between 16 and 17, not quite 18 yet, but if those of you have had teenagers or worked with them, you know they know everything. And of course I did. And I was going to barge into my dad's bedroom because he was upstairs taking a nap, and I was going to tell him off and tell him what was, what was really right. Well, I finally got up enough courage. I burst through the door, and my dad was kneeling down with his head tucked into his hands, and he was deep in prayer. And the visual sight alone shocked me, because in my head I'm thinking, he still gets on his knees to pray. Teenagers, they know everything. I was wrong.
Okay. Growing up, one of the things to talk about or think about was, did your friends talk about it? How was it being a war hero's daughter? We didn't know anything. We didn't know that. We didn't talk about it ever. How many kids didn't sit up at 1 or 2 in the morning on a Friday or Saturday night with their dad and go, blah, blah, blah. And then he'd almost invite you to ask a question. And when you did it, we don't want to go there. We don't want to go there. I mean, what kid didn't do that at 1 or 2 in the morning? It was, growing up, this was normal, It was, our house was chaotic, and I didn't even realize it was chaotic till I was like in my 30s. And I'd say 20s, give me a break. I was in my 20s. But until I had children, and they turned 17, 18, and then and I also saw Memphis Belle, probably around that time. It was a great movie, and then the second time I watched it, was like, that's my dad. And then when my boys got that age, it's like, oh my God, Grandma. I felt so bad for Grandma. And all in all, it was a crazy great life. we're here. And it was hard to start the manuscript and start the book. And damn it, I know the ending.
Well, after that enlightenment, I'll I'll just move on to when I was 5, because, well, Dad was fire chief. This is when they told me I should tell, and I like fire. And the puppies were cold. It was a cold October, I think, and I don't. There was a lot of. Duchess was a horror. She just was. Always, I can't say that. Excuse me. Duchess had a lot of puppies, a lot. That was our dog, Lori's dog. Anyway, I thought they were cold, so I thought I would warm the puppies up. So I got some straw that was out in the garage, and I heated up the puppies, and it was time to get done. I did a real nice job, and Smokey the Bear always said, stir, sand, water. Well, he really didn't. He said water, sand, stir. And I'm here to tell you, if you do stir, sand, water, you will burn the garage down. So I saw the fire trucks come. It was time for me to leave. At 5 years old, I knew that much. Time to go. So I ran down the street about a quarter mile and hid behind the church. And little did I know that my good friend John Felton was in the garage looking for me. He thought I was on fire. I didn't know that for years and years that John went in looking for me. But when they found me, I was hiding, and I had these matches with me. Hard to believe. And then I was proceeded to be invited into the living room or into the kitchen because I remember exactly where I was standing. And he said something about pull your pants down. And I think I got a pretty good whooping, and I didn't play with matches for 2 or 3 weeks after that.
And you wonder why our hair color is the color that we all have. I'm just going to share one story when I was a teenager. There were several when I was a teenager because that's about the time I started to realize that there were stories that I should know, didn't know, couldn't know. And we were at the dinner table and we were having baked potatoes, one of our favorite things. And, we always had, basically we had butter and a potato flavoring on the side. But Mom had said something to Dad just nonchalantly. They'd had their own kind of language, and she said, I thought you were never going to eat potato skins again. And of course, you don't ask the questions because you knew something behind the scenes meant that had to do something with when he must have been, in the war. So when I was washing dishes after, Mom and I were out in the kitchen, and I said, hey, Mom, what did he mean by that? And she said, well, at one point, that's all he was able to eat. That's all they fed them, was the potato skins from what they peeled for the others in the prison. So that was my first kick in the gut for knowing a few things. And then as you tried to get more knowledge, you didn't want to ask because you didn't want to see him go into that state of sadness. So again, lots of stories, and I do want to thank John personally for, as my sister Liz, who's not here, would say this was a gift to our family. So thank you, John, for that. And Pat is here with us tonight. He wasn't mentioned, but we often forget him.
Just kidding. That's my family. Being the youngest, I may not have experienced a lot of the same unique things that my older siblings did with my parents. But my dad was the same age as many of my classmates' grandparents. And one thing that resonated with me, I remember I was in first or second grade at Orchard View, which is not very far from Rolling Ground Store and Tavern, which is mentioned in the book. And we'd get out of school, and the school bus would always be there. And I remember it was fall, and I came out of the class, and next to the school bus was my dad's Scout that he used for the mail route. And he had my hunting coat with him. And one of the coolest things was I got to go squirrel hunting with my dad after school, and everybody else had to get on the bus and go home. And that was one of the things I always thought was one of the coolest things about being with my dad. I never knew he was so much older than my other classmates' parents. And so as I grew up, like my brothers and sisters, I knew you didn't go there. You didn't ask the question because he didn't want to tell you the answer. And if he did go into a state, you didn't want to be there when he went into that state. But it was 1981 or 1982. I think I was the last one left in the house. And he called, my name's Patrick John. And he called me, John, come and look at the top of my head. So he sat in his favorite chair, and we were watching the weatherman from Channel 8. Anyway, he said, look at the top of my head and tell me what you see. I don't know, it's bald. But I said, looks like you have 3 red spots on the top of your head. He said, yep, I think the screws are working their way out again. Because he had a plate that was put in his head, if I'm not mistaken. And that stuck with me, that he must have gone through hell. So, thank you, Jim. Yeah. Yep.
The story begins in November 1943 when Gene arrived in England. At this point, most of Europe is under the Nazi jackboot, and the American plan at that time, before the D-Day invasion, was to destroy Germany from the air with strategic bombers. And they thought that these bombers could protect themselves. The American military brass, they were wrong. Thousands, tens of thousands of men died in these missions. Gene's plane, this is Gene home on summer leave right before he went to Europe, and this is his plane, the only known photo of his plane, Ricky Tikki Tavi. When he got to Europe, it was a used plane that had already had 12 missions, and I'll never forget through research, through a relative that found that picture, and when I had my Thursdays with Gene interviews, I remember showing him that picture sheepishly, which I got to be kind of careful whether I show this or not in class, depending on the age. And I'm like, is this the plane? He's like, yeah, that's the dolly. And I said, that's right, Gene, a lot of planes had those pictures. And that is his crew. There's Gene in the upper left-hand corner. Only 2 of them would come back from Europe. The other one that survived, Jesse Orson, on the bottom, second from the right, you could have also written a book about his survival story. And yes, as they said, Gene came home and didn't talk about it for 50 years. You heard what the kids knew, which wasn't much. In 1992, a flying fortress came into La Crosse, Wisconsin, and Gene went up to drive and just to take a look at it, and a reporter heard about him and asked him a few questions. And he's got about 3-4 quotes here, and that's it. Very short, very brief, nothing there. This is what Joni gave me after she rebuffed my attempt to get Gene to come to my class to speak. And she goes, here, this is all we have. If you ever talk to him about it, you'll know more than I do. In 2007, Congressman Ron Kind, who's just retiring this year from the U.S. House of Representatives, had a Gene Day, so to speak, in La Crosse. Brought in a flying fortress, honored a few veterans, and Gene got to ride in a flying fortress for the first time since he was shot down in 1943. And he was in the local media, kind of a star for the day, television newscasts at night. Gene finally started to talk a little bit. Ron interviewed him for 20 minutes as part of his Veterans Oral History program. It didn't go very far, the interview. Gene abruptly stopped it. I felt kind of badly for Ron. I was there, and I thought, that's the way it's going to be. That story is going to the grave. Over the next couple years, many of Gene's family, some veteran friends, and myself, he's got to say something. He's got to talk to an author. He's got to get this is an amazing story. It can't go to the grave. Gene's in his mid-80s at this point. And this is, the picture didn't, this is Gene with my 2 sons at the La Crosse airport, Joe on the left, Matthew on the right. And we just even they started asking questions, and I'm like, nobody knows. And so in 2010, I'll back up just a bit. In 2010, Joni came up to me and said, well, why don't you write it? And I laughed, and I'm like, no. I said, I'm 20 years removed from writing high school basketball stories. You need a real author. I knew Gene pretty well, and he really liked my late wife. And about a week later, Joni came back and said, well, he'll do it, but only if you do it. And I thought, in my ignorance and arrogance, yeah, what the hell? Let's write a book. I had no idea what I was getting into. Not only that, at the time, my wife was suffering from stage 4 brain cancer, a disease she fought for 10 years before it finally took her in 2012. We're in the middle of that fight. I'm the last person in the world that should be writing a book. But it truly became a situation, if I don't do it, who will? So I needed some help. And this is a man's name. If you're from southwestern Wisconsin, maybe around here you know who he is. He wrote one of the most important books, I believe, ever from the state of Wisconsin, The Land Remembers. His name is Ben Logan, a very well-known author. I was lucky enough to get to know him in the last 10 years of his life. I would take my students to his house to see the land that he immortalized in that book, The Land Remembers. I went to see Ben in a nursing home, also a World War II combat veteran. And I told him my situation, and he said, well, Gene's story deserves a book. And he said, when you interview him, start with farm stories, talk about baseball, and then later get to the war stories. And if he stops, if he becomes quiet, just back off. He might come to it later. Now, at this point, I'm starting to get excited. The great Ben Logan is saying, I can do this. Now, I knew Ben was also a combat veteran. He was in the Navy. He was a captain of landing craft that would land on invasion beaches in Italy under combat. One night on a mission, he got sick, very sick with a stomach ailment. A replacement commander took over for him, and his landing craft hit a German mine and blew his entire crew up and killed them all. I knew that story, and I knew it was one that you didn't talk about with Ben very often. And I remember sitting there in that nursing home with him, and after I'm all excited about doing the book, he reaches over and grabs my arm and says, this whole thing may blow up in your face. So, December 2010, Country Gardens Tavern, Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. I'm meeting Joni, Gene's new wife, Pauline. To tell you something about this man, Gene's wife, Peg, died in 2003. Gene remarried at age 85. That tells you a lot about Gene Moran. And I had spent a lot of time with Gene before, watching Packer games. He attended my son's birthdays and first communions, but we never talked about the war. This was the first night we were going to talk about the war. I drove straight from work and parked in front of the tavern. I sat in my dark vehicle. The car thermometer registered a mere 10 degrees. The last shards of pink sky faded to night. I hadn't eaten in hours, but I had no appetite. Of course, I'd shared meals with Gene before, but this time the stakes were so high. I stared at the red and white neon Budweiser sign in the tavern window and wrestled with my self-doubt. I am not a writer. I spend 58+ hours a week at my school. I have 2 growing sons. And the question that shadowed everything, as it had for 8 years, would my wife's cancer return? But if I didn't write Gene's story, who would? I headed into the tavern. The place was full. Men nursing cans of Bud Light and Coors Light sat on bar stools that ringed the oval bar. Couples stood along the walls, sipping brandy old-fashioned cocktails and glasses of white Zinfandel wine while they waited to be called to their tables. Joni and her family had already staked out a table in the rear of the dining room. Gene wore his usual bib overalls and Army Air Corps baseball cap. He sat across the table from me next to Pauline, his wife now of 2 years. Joni kept the conversation light, but I said little. The waitress jotted down our orders for beer and soda. Gene asked for a can of Blatz. The smell of fried cod and steaming baked potatoes arrived at our table, helped settle my nerves a little bit. It was time to talk book. I looked at Gene, swallowed hard, and began. I was thinking about starting after Christmas. On Thursdays after school, for an hour or so. Will that work? I asked. Gene kept eating, not looking up. That would be fine, John, he replied, nodding his head, eyes riveted on his fish. I'd like to get in as many interviews as we can before spring, I added. Gene knew I operated a side business to supplement my teaching income. I raised apples, cherries, and raspberries on the 5 acres of my rural home. But as soon as school's out, we can pick back up with the interviews. Gene nodded. I want to talk mostly about your growing up, is how we'll start. On the farm, move to the war later, I said. I hoped talk of his childhood instead of the war would put Gene at ease, but I could sense Joni was getting restless. Dad, she burst out. There's so much you haven't told anybody. She rushed on. You need to talk about your prisoner of war days and the ship ride. The ship ride when the Germans transferred you. We know nothing about that. Gene stopped eating and slowly set his fork down. He set both his arms on the table, looked up, and sat back in his chair. I didn't like what was happening. Joni's mention of the ship had stirred something in Gene. I closed my eyes and said to myself, Jesus Christ, Joni, shut up! You're moving too fast. But she pressed on, firing questions, rapidly talking, oblivious to her father's change in mood. Gene turned toward his daughter and roared, there are some things that are never going to go into any book. Everyone at the table froze. Nearby diners stopped talking. I didn't know what to say or do. I thought about Ben Logan's warning to me just 5 minutes into this project, and it was already blowing up in my face. Gene, I said at last, this is your story. We don't need to do this. Gene quietly picked up his can of Blatz and took a sip. He studied me for a moment, then his face softened. John, he said, his voice much quieter, if we don't do it now, it will never happen. So starting January, a few weeks later of that year, for the next 3 years, Thursdays with Gene, interrupted occasionally by my wife's fight with cancer, from this very humble abode came one of the greatest war stories of World War II. This is what Gene looked like during our interviews during 2011 through 2014. I interviewed him right up until 2 weeks before his death of heart failure. As Gene said, he'd rather wear out than rust out. He had just got back from snowmobiling, had a fishing trip in Canada planned that summer, and a big party planned for his 90th birthday.
Were you still conscious?
Oh, yeah.
Were you stuck up there?
No. When it settled in, I caught it on the upswing.
I caught it the tree. You caught the tree, yeah.
They said lit in a tree. I didn't light in no tree. I lit against the tree.
You laid against the tree?
Against the tree on the upswing of the...
Okay. When you were twisting out, you're coming in.
Yeah,
Okay.
and this open part went down on the ground.
Okay, that makes sense.
And
Okay.
I crawled out the open part. Because then this open part dropped right down on the ground.
And then the open part kind of slid into the ground.
And I got turned around and crawled out. And by that time, the Frenchmen were there.
That fast?
Yeah. Oh, hell, they were watching the whole thing.
And how quickly between the time you crawled out and the Frenchmen were there?
Well, it could have been over 5 minutes.
5 minutes, they'd been watching.
They'd been watching. They were just jabbering and going on, pointing at the sky, pointing at me, and pointing at the tail of the plane. I never knew why we slid back that day. I'll never know to this all. I will never know.
Slid back.
We were right up in formation.
Mm-hmm.
Just, of course, they were just shooting at us something terrible everywhere, but we're still up.
Oh, wait, the day you slid back, the day you got shot down?
Yeah. And we slid back, kept sliding back. And I even called and I said, what's the matter? We're not staying up in formation. We're being pushed out. Well, I don't know what he meant by being pushed out or what. Whoever answered me, I can't remember. And boy, when we got pushed out.
Is that when the fighters all started hopping on you then? Yeah. When you guys started falling back, how many fighters were starting to hit you guys?
Well, I was shooting. Both waist gunners were shooting. The ball turret gunner was shooting. The top turret gun guy was shooting. And I believe the bombardier, he had that little gun poked out the one side. He was shooting too.
Yep. After Pee-wee hit and Orson's pushing the bombardier out, is the plane sustaining any damage at this point?
Oh, it's just getting rid of it.
Just
It wasn't the one that came up underneath. It was one that drifted in that came in. Well, I could even see his scarf and his goggles.
you said you could see a scarf in his goggles.
Yeah, and he pointed down.
And you didn't know why he pointed
No,
down?
I figured he meant bail out.
Bail out. Okay.
That's what I figured he meant, but somebody cut loose up in front. Trapped, but you gotta remember, I got a bone sticking out of this arm.
Oh, well, I didn't know. When did that happen?
Oh, that happened through the mission. See, it started here and come up here, and I got bones sticking up through.
When did that happen in the mission?
On that mission.
But I mean, at what point?
Well, I don't know. I was too busy.
Which
This one here was, oh hell, it was all bleeding out through the suit.
When did you get hit? I didn't know you'd been hit before that.
Oh God, I was hit 3 or 4 times. I had all these ribs broke. And then I started to crawl up to get, I had a chest suit laying right in front of the tail wheel. And I crawled up to get that, and all at once it just started down, and you can't move. And all at once it broke in two, and I'm looking right out into space. He said, young man, he said, you come back with any more of these forged papers. And he said, you won't need to have to worry about going into service. He said, I admire you for wanting to get into service this bad. But he said, you forged any more papers. And he said, I'll have you put where you won't need to worry about the service. So home, and I went home, and I said, well, I'm in the service now. How could you? We didn't sign for you. Well, I said, I forged your names. Well, we can get that wrote. No, I said, you can't. I'm already sworn in, and I wasn't. But I said, you'd make it a lot easier for me if you would sign these papers, in case they ever come back and check on it. Well, if you're that determined to go and get yourself killed, we'll sign them. It's the most beautiful thing to go up above, get above them clouds and see the sun. Oh, wow. It looks just like a city. That is the most beautiful thing that I have ever seen in my life.
How did you check if oxygen worked? How did you check that?
You know, if you had a little hangover, you get done hooked, and you stuck that in your mouth, and then you turn the valve. And if your head cleared right up, the oxygen was working.
Oh my God.
The oxygen was working.
what made you guys such good friends?
If they didn't live, you didn't live.
Okay.
And I could never find the quote, but I know in my reams of audio quotes with Gene, he said they were closer than brothers. And here we are, Memorial Day 2022. I appreciate your patience going through that last part. There was supposed to be music that accompanied that last segment, but we got to see the important parts, the pictures and the quotes. And at this point, I believe Colin will coming up here, and I will now take any questions that you may have. Is that correct, Colin?
That is correct, but a round of applause for John, the author. The Moran family for coming up bravely and being on stage. A round of applause for them. And for Chris starting us off with that beautiful song, Danny Boy. So yes, if you have questions, I will run around. I don't mind running around in AC rather than outside, as it is a little humid.
Was Walter Reed the same Walter Reed the hospital is named
No,
after?
no, just a coincidence. Walter's from Nebraska. He was a chicken farmer, not a doctor.
Great story.
Thank you.
I still don't understand how he survived the crash. How is that physically possible, or how could you talk about that more? How is that physically possible?
Absolutely. In 2018, the city, about the size of Marshfield, Wisconsin, where Gene crashed, held a 75th anniversary. The Germans know the story better than we do. So about 30 of us, members of the crew and Gene's family, went over to Germany for the celebration. We went to the exact spot where Gene fell. Now, this whole time, I'm expecting an alpine forest, sloping hillsides, giant pine trees that would cushion that blow. It was a little nondescript, marshy, wooded area. And a German television crew came up to me and said, looked at the same thing. It's like, this doesn't make any sense. Can you explain how he survived? And I said, no, I can't. I have no idea. Neither did Gene.
Did he tell you anything, any details about his concentration camp days?
An awful lot. And I think that's one of the more satisfying parts of writing this story. There are so many people that don't know what happened to those prisoners. Unfortunately for Gene, I mean, the treatment varied, but he ended up in a camp that was not run by some very nice people. They were sergeant gunners, considered lower class by the Germans, and they were not treated very well. The ship that I mentioned earlier in a story with Joni, that was 3 days on when the Russians were coming. They moved from Lithuania on what was called the Hell ship. They packed 1,000 starving, filthy prisoners into a coal ship that had room for maybe 100, 200. And many died, and he was transferred to that ship in the middle of summer. No bathrooms, no food, no water inside the hull of a ship. They got off the ship. They were forced to run in chains to their next POW camp. And the conditions there, as described in the book, were not good. They were running out of food, as were the entire German army was. So prisoners were not high on the list of priorities to be fed. And then he ended it. Again, the Germans moved them at the end of the war. He had suffered a 600-mile, what's known as the European Death March at the end of the war, where they lost another 1,000 guys due to malnutrition, disease, dysentery. Not many people know of that death march, as say, the Bataan Death March in the Philippines during World War II, because that's when the Allies were also finding the Jewish concentration camps, which was dominating the headlines then. So these guys went home, and very few people knew about this story. So it's an honor for me to bring light to that story, the Death March. From his prison to nowhere. The Germans were moving them around, trying to keep them ahead of the Russians. There was some thought that, in my research, that Hitler wanted to use the prisoners as bargaining chips at the end of the war, and some of the German high command, we'll give you these prisoners if you do some things for us. And finally, the Americans found them and liberated them. 600 miles in 2 months, sleeping and living outside for 2 months in late winter, early spring, with very little food and water.
I was just wondering if you've shared your story with any screenwriters.
I just finished the book. That has been brought up to me. No, not yet. People have been urging me to do that. I have talked to one author, well, Colin actually talked to authors, said that making a movie from a World War II story is about the pace of a glacier forming. It takes quite a while. So would I be open to the idea? Yes, but I don't want to be so presumptuous as to assume that it's going to happen. So. I think visually there's a lot going on. It would make a heck of a movie, yes. Yes, they're intertwining stories. Gene is an old man. My struggle to get the story out as my wife is dying, and then, of course, Gene's combat story. I got a couple ideas of some parts I want to play in the movie, so if they want a movie, they're going to have to let me act a little bit. There's a German officer that was a real jerk I want to play, so not a real character stretch for me, so we'll see. Yes, I am. I'm in Westby, Wisconsin, about a half hour north of Soldiers Grove. After my wife died, I enjoyed North Crawford very, very much, but when my wife died, my sons were going to school, and it made life a lot easier to be in the same school district as them, so I switched jobs. Sadly, I love North Crawford, but I've had a good experience at Westby too, but 29 years total teaching. Thank you.
Where did the name Ricky Tikki Tavi originate from?
I have no idea. And no, that's funny because Ricky Tikki Tavi is a fictional mongoose in a Rudyard Kipling story. But on the plane is a naked woman riding a bomb. I'm like, I don't even want to go there. I don't know why that plane was named that, but it was a used plane that already had a dozen missions when they got to Europe. And so they were the next crew. The crew that had the plane had finished their required 25 missions, which was very rare in 1943 to finish all 25 missions. They were very lucky men, and Gene and his crew took over that plane.
There was a sailor named Thor Heyerdahl, and he sailed in a boat called Ricky Tikki Tavi that was made out of bamboo.
Perhaps, maybe, it came from there. When that plane was shot down, there was also another plane, Ricky Tikki Tavi II in World War II, so sometimes people get that confused. But yeah, Gene didn't know the origin story behind his plane's name, and so I don't either.
There are several names. I just looked up to see if your book was on any distribution list, for instance, because of an audio book, and there's 4 different books listed that are said Tailspin. So how does this fit in?
Yes, that was my editor's idea. We were working around with a couple different titles, and it just popped into her head one day, Tailspin. And it took me all of 1 second to say, that's it. It just fit the story so well. But then I said, there are a couple other books out there named Tailspin. One's a smut romance novel, another about a falling gloom and doom economic story. And she said, that's okay, there are other books that share titles, and it fits so perfectly, I agreed to go ahead with it. Where is the other survivor, or how? Yes. Yes, Jesse Orison died in 1997. When the tail separated from the rest of the plane flew out over the city of Zika, about 25,000, and blew up. Jesse Orson, the navigator, was in the front of the plane, and the explosion propelled him out through the plexiglass nose. He had his parachute on, was severely cut up and wounded, but lived. I could have written a book about Jesse's story, too. I think the most beautiful thing is Jesse and Gene were lifelong friends, a bond that I can't even go to understand what those two shared, what they survived, and his son Wayne is still alive. I talk with Wayne quite a bit, who shared me some. But Wayne too was like, when I first saw Wayne 7 years ago, he's like, John, I don't have much for you. Dad rarely talked about the war. I'll do the best I can.
I think it mentioned in your story that the Frenchmen found him. I thought I assume they were on the German side, or what happened there?
No, there was a POW camp nearby, and the Germans would let the Frenchmen out to scrounge for food. Because it's 1943, where are they going to escape to? It's all under German occupation. So the Germans would allow them, because the prison camp was low on food, that just select prisoners, certainly not the Russians. But they allowed the Frenchmen to go scrounging for food. And what they would do is watch bomber raids and watch planes crash, and they'd go scavenging. They knew the American flyers carried Hershey bars with them. And when Gene was found by the Frenchmen, they yanked his microphone off his neck because they used that stuff to make underground radios. So they scavenged. And when Gene, they thought he was dead laying on the ground. When Gene looked up at them and he cried, "Doctor, doctor," they just freaked out. And then about a little while later, they went and got the Germans, and they picked him up with an ox cart, paraded him through the nearby town where Gene was almost killed, the town that wanted to lynch him. They came to kill him. Ironically, it was the German soldiers that saved him and beat the crowd away. It was a frequent occurrence to lynch American flyers that were found, because a lot of those American bombs did not hit their targets and destroyed a lot of German homes. So Gene was almost killed after he was found. Yeah. Five credited, but he was up 19 times, and that was something that always bothered him because there were a couple times they fought their way all the way to the target. But if you didn't drop the bombs on the target assigned or the secondary target, you got no credit for that mission, and that really ticked Gene off. He flew just about every day that month of November.
How have the students responded to your presentations?
My students?
Well, or any students that you've done so far. How many of these presentations have you done so far?
It's kind of funny. They kind of look at me like I'm a celebrity for about 5 minutes. Then they're back to being 8th graders again. It's kind of a weird thing. They'll come up to me, and some of them are buying the book, and I sign for them. I've spoken at a few high schools. I have some more scheduled this fall. I think kids really get into it. They identify with Gene. Gene was kind of a rascal, to be quite honest with you. It wasn't, that fall, by the way, was not, I think about someone as how did he survive. His sister Joanne, who's here, said, when I asked her about that, she said, he had half those lives spent before he even went to war. Really quickly, Gene's senior trip, he was in Minneapolis. He crashed from a hotel balcony trying to jump into the girls' apartment next door. He crashed a couple stories into someone else's room right through the glass ceiling, and this principal picked him up at the police station the next morning. That's Gene Moran, and the high school kids love that story, so.
Again, a round of applause for John and everybody for here tonight. Oh, did we have one more? Oh, I can use my cheerleader voice.
John, what are some of the other titles you've considered?
Just a few, something about, I remember a quote once, Gene never ever talked about religion or politics. He simply told the story. And one day I just stopped and I'm like, you got to put some perspective on this. I said, how did you survive this? How did any of you guys survive this? And he talked about his generation. And excuse the swear word here, but he said, John, we were tougher than boiled owl shit. And I thought about using something about that for a title. I'm like, that's not going to work. So we played around with that. But when my editor came up with Tailspin, I settled on that immediately. So I just want to say, but to end, before I go outside to sign books, I want to thank Colin very much for these presentations that he does. I mean, he's a teacher in Edgar. He's very, very busy. Yet he has these wonderful programs that he brings to North Central Wisconsin to educate you about history. So I want to give Colin a round of applause and thank him very much. And one more shout out for Chris, who opened with the song. Those drawings you saw in the video, she did all those drawings. As I tell people, Chris is so talented, she's just weird, all right? And my son Matthew for being here, and the Moran family for coming up on stage here, and thank you very much. I'll meet you out in the hallway.
Yeah. Okay. Now, before we leave and stuff like that, yep, John will go out there in case to buy some more books and stuff. But the guy that's walking out by the exit right there, his name is Nathan Holtz. And he is my partner in crime, not only with these programs, but in the same classroom. So can you imagine that? Like how We try to stay on task, but I think we entertain a lot of those fifth graders too with our stories, meeting such great people like John and the Moran family, Chris and stuff. When we go back to the classroom, they're like, all right, so what did you guys do this weekend? And then it's story time. But this program fell because of connections, and it was on short notice. Joni went to Yankee's bookstore, and Jane said, hey, call this guy. And after a long talk on a Friday, I think it went over an hour, Bugs and Joni and John and Chris and I met at 2510. I don't even know if I touched my food or if I just had coffee, because we talked for another 2 to 3 hours to put this all together. And it was on the enthusiasm from Bugs and Joni and Chris and John that I knew this was going to work. And when I went to Wausau Legion and the Edgar Legion in VFW, it was met with, we can do this. We can pull this off on a busy weekend. And so I appreciate you guys coming out here, and I appreciate the connections and the drive of getting this story out, because yes, when it was brought up, if you look up the book, it got launched on April 30th. So we're not even 30 days. There's 83 reviews. 97% of them give it a 5-star rating. And so when we're talking about movies, been there, done that, wondering when this is going to become a movie and everything. And actually, the author he was talking about was Doug Stanton. I reached out to Doug and I said, Doug, what do we have to do to get a movie made? And that's when he said, glaciers might move faster than getting movies made. But we are going to push for this because it needs to be on the red carpet. It needs to be seen by all. But through these connections, that's why we have these programs. And so when you look up there, it's amazing that this community can pull this off, not only for 15 years, but next year is year 16. And so before you leave, it fits really nice in your book. A bookmark, not only with our logo, a walk in their shoes, but then also 4 stories that we are going to be featuring. So again, without further ado, I would like to read out those logos and those names, as they deserve a thank you and credit. The Dudley Foundation, Berg Sales, MP&C, Toyota of Wausau, Nicolay Bank of Wausau and Edgar, Badger Basket, Covantage Credit Union, Edgar Lyons, Edgar Legion, Hugum Law Firm, Yankee Bookstore, Edgar School District, People State Bank, the Edgar Area JCs, the Wausau Noon Optimist, Young's Drug Store, Edgar Sport and Spine, Rebecca Larson, Wisconsin Public Radio, Knights of Columbus, Reuter Ware, Edgar FFA, Southport Engineer Systems, in memory of Daniel J. Merkus, Wausau School District, Cadott School District, Terry and Colleen Gerink, Montgomery Plant Dudley Post 10, Jack and Sally Listra, David and Darlene Vasine, Bartels and Pease Ltd., Carrie and John Lashinsky, Sue Shackle, Joni Moran Peterson, the Greenheck Fan Corporation, Edgar PTO, Edgar VFW, Godorsey, ELM of Edgar, Jefferson Street Inn, Scotty's, The Mint Cafe, Fenwood Lions, Samuels Group, Abbey Bank, the Edgar IGA, Marathon County Public Library, Midwest Dental, BAME Insurance, Walmart, Marathon Cheese Corporation, Dale and Amy Dalkey, Cloverbelt Credit Union, CCT Controlled Concepts Technology, Wood Trust Bank, Heil Harvest, Edgar Area Education Foundation, Judd S. Alexander Foundation, Richard and Paula Barnes, NWA Northwestern Wisconsin Associates, UWSP Wausau Campus, Northern Lutheran School District, Vietnam Veterans of America, Disabled American Veterans, Aspirus Health, Marathon County Special Education, Community Foundation of North Central Wisconsin, T&J Concrete, Wisconsin Public Service, the Flatham family, B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation. A round of applause for our sponsors. And, have a great and wonderful Memorial Day weekend. Thanks for coming.